Chapter 30. An hour after the explosive revelations, Jericho was alive with a palpable sense of upheaval. The town, once comfortably anchored in its secrets, now found itself writhing in the wake of the revelations about the Gates family's dark history. The videos Adele had made public had ignited a firestorm, and the streets were thick with conversation. The townsfolk no longer whispered in hushed tones. No, now they were openly discussing the disgrace of the Gates family, and not just the murder of Garrett Gates. The deeper scandal, their attempted genocide against the so-called outcasts, had shattered the illusion of the family's good name. In the local diner, a group of regulars sat at their usual booth, but the atmosphere had shifted from casual chatter to fervent discussion. The waitress, a young woman who had always kept her head down, now stood at the counter, arms folded, staring at the news on her phone. "Can you believe it?" one of the older men at the table muttered, shaking his head as he crumpled his napkin. "Poisoning his own son to wipe out people he didn't like. And that wasn't even the worst of it. All the outcasts they tried to kill, hell, they weren't even hurting anyone. Just wanted to live their lives." His companion, a man in his late 30s, frowned. "I always knew the Gates family was hiding something, but this? It's worse than I thought. We're talking about a planned extermination. The town would have been gone if they'd succeeded in getting rid of everyone who didn't fit their perfect little world." A few others at the table nodded grimly, sharing in the disgust. "Hell, I'm glad they're finally exposed for what they are," the older man continued. "People like Ansel Gates, thinking they're above everyone else just because they have money. They didn't care who they hurt." At the corner booth, another man, a carpenter who had been in Jericho for decades, chimed in. "They didn't care about anyone. Those videos weren't just about Garrett Gates' death. They're about the whole damn town. Do you remember all the disappearances over this year? How people just vanished? They were all part of this. All part of that disgusting plan." "Yeah," the waitress added, her voice sharp, "and now we see why Sheriff Walkner always had his hands tied. They were all in on it, the mayor, the sheriff, the whole damn town system. And now, it all comes crashing down." Outside, on the town square, a group of younger residents, most of whom had been part of the so-called outcast groups in Jericho, gathered together, forming a small but vocal group. They huddled together in animated discussion, their faces marked by both disbelief and vindication. "Honestly, I never thought we'd see the day," one of the men said, leaning against a bench. "The Gates family wasn't just a bunch of rich snobs, they were actual monsters. Trying to wipe out people who didn't fit their perfect image of normal. But you know what? Good riddance to them. This town will be better off without that kind of poison lingering around." Another man, arms crossed, added, "Makes me wonder how many of us were just lucky to be here, you know? How many times did they look at us and decide, that one's a threat, get rid of him? Yeah, those gates are gonna be forever stained now," a woman in the group said with a scoff. "And the worst part? There are people still out there who are going to defend them. People who think just because the Gates were rich, they could do no wrong." Behind them, Miss Thornhill, or as the town now knew her, Laura Gates, stood quietly, listening to the conversation from a distance. Her eyes narrowed as she took in the words of the people around her. The revelations about her family, now public knowledge, had shattered the fragile facade of the Gates name, and there she stood, a living, breathing reminder of it. But for Laura, the weight of the shame wasn't something she felt to the bone. No, it was something else entirely. A deep, bitter rage boiled within her. As the town chewed over the wreckage of her family's legacy, the venomous words of the outcasts around her only fueled her hatred. She had always been taught that the outcasts, the so-called freaks, were the problem. They were the ones who didn't belong. And now, hearing their gloating and self-righteousness, her loathing only deepened. "They have no idea what it's like," she muttered to herself, barely audible to anyone else. "They have no idea what we sacrificed, what we tried to protect. They call us monsters, but they don't know the half of it. They never will." Her hands clenched into fists at her sides as she walked away from the group, determined to hold on to her own narrative, her own identity. The name Gates might be tarnished forever, but in her mind, the outcasts had only shown their true colors. They were just as twisted, just as broken, as the family they condemned. Not far from her, Sheriff Galvin stood, still processing the fallout. He had thought he was in control of the situation. After all, he'd been tasked with arresting Gomez Addams, believing that the Addams family had played a direct hand in covering up Garrett Gates' death. But now, faced with the videos, the ugly truth he'd never imagined, his stomach churned with regret. He'd been so sure of his facts, so sure of his standing. He hadn't realized just how much deeper the corruption went. Hadn't realized how far back the darkness went. The mayor, Wachner, and Ansel Gates had all kept their hands clean, using him as a pawn in their game, and now, everything was coming to light. Worse yet, he had walked into this mess without consulting Wachner first, and now it felt like every step had been miscalculated. Galvin approached a small group of town council members gathered on the steps of the courthouse, their expressions mixed between anger and fear. The sharp clang of the office door shutting echoed through Principal Weems's office as she stormed in, her face red with fury. "What on earth were you thinking, Miss Addams?" she exploded, her voice trembling with anger. Adele barely looked up from her phone, her fingers tapping idly across the screen. "That's easy," she said with a shrug. I wasn't about to let my uncle step foot in jail. Even if prison sentences are celebrated in my family, that doesn't mean we take kindly to anyone who wants to exploit us. Last one who tried, well, he ended up dead. You've gone too far this time, Weems snarled, her face a mixture of disbelief and fury. Exposing all of that to the entire town? You've made a spectacle of this school and everyone involved. Do you realize the chaos you've caused? This is going to reflect badly on every one of us. And you did this without consulting me. Without consulting anyone. Adele grinned, her expression mockingly sweet. If you want to blame someone, blame Sheriff Galvin. He should have known by now who he was up against. He didn't exactly cover himself in glory, did he? Principal Weems's nostrils flared as she stepped closer. I will fire you, Miss Addams. Do you understand me? I can make this a lot harder for you. Adele's laughter rang out, a sharp, taunting sound. Too bad you can't. I'm court-mandated to be here. Good luck trying to convince Washington to transfer my community service somewhere else. She leaned back in her chair, still grinning. Nice try though. Weems clenched her fists, her jaw tight. Fine. You're untouchable, for now. But since you seem so confident, I want you to go out there and reassure the parents that everything is fine. They're scared. Calm them down. Make them believe that they have nothing to worry about. Adele's eyes rolled. The incident happened 30 years ago, Weems. The Gates family are all dead now. Why are you still pretending this is some big crisis? Weems glared at her. This is not the time for your sarcasm, Miss Addams. Adele raised an eyebrow, ignoring her. Fine. I'll go talk to the parents. She stood up, slipping her phone into her pocket and walking out of the office with a casual flick of her hair. Later, the auditorium buzzed with tension. Parents filled the seats, some whispering anxiously to one another, others clutching their children tightly, as though the walls themselves might collapse under the weight of their fears. Adele stood at the front, the spotlight shining down on her as she stepped onto the stage. She let the crowd's murmurs build for a moment before she spoke, her voice cutting through the tension with eerie calm. People. Adele's voice rang out, commanding attention. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. The incident happened 30 years ago. The Gates family is dead now. So don't be so dramatic. She let the words hang in the air as parents shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One parent, a middle-aged man with furrowed brows, stood up from the back. What about the serial killer that's still out there? He demanded, his voice laced with fear. Adele didn't flinch. She simply stared at him, her gaze unwavering. Your kids are werewolves, vampires, gorgons, and sirens. What exactly are you afraid of? She said flatly, as though the answer should have been obvious. There was a beat of stunned silence before she narrowed her eyes and her voice dropped to a more serious tone. I think you're forgetting we are not defenseless normies. If anyone dares to attack your children, they have the right to self-defense. I know you're scared for them. I know you want to keep them safe. But the best way to protect them is to prepare them for whatever lies beyond these walls. She let her words sink in, letting the gravity of her statement fill the room. If you want your kids to be caught off guard by reality, then maybe you're doing the wrong thing here. You won't always be around to protect them. They need to be able to stand on their own 2 feet. If they can survive in a world that isn't built for them, then we'll know we've done our job. She paused, letting the final words hang in the air before adding, but if you feel like your kids are safer elsewhere, then by all means, send them away. The room went dead silent for a moment. Then, a single parent in the back started clapping, slowly, at first, before another joined in. It built and built until the entire auditorium erupted into applause. Parents, students, even teachers joined in, the sound overwhelming. The fear, the tension, the uncertainty seemed to fade with each clap, each cheer. Principal Weems, standing off to the side with the other teachers, exchanged a reluctant look with a few staff members before they too joined in the applause, though it was clear they didn't share the same enthusiasm. As the applause died down, the parents and children began filing out, their expressions mixed. Some looked reassured, while others seemed to remain on edge. But for the moment, the storm had passed. Afterward, in the quiet of the hallway, Principal Weems approached Adele, her face a mixture of admiration and begrudging respect. You've always had an act for leading people, she said, her voice a little softer now. Adele let out a heavy sigh, rolling her shoulders. I just hope this doesn't blow up in our faces, she muttered, eyes distant. One problem at a time. She ran a hand through her hair, the weight of the situation settling heavily on her shoulders. The warm, candlelit restaurant was a familiar setting for the Addams family, though tonight the atmosphere felt heavier. Pugsley was happily consumed by his plate of spaghetti, oblivious to the conversation swirling around him. Morticia, Gomez, and Wednesday were deep in discussion, with Adele leaning back in her chair, her eyes occasionally flicking toward the others but mostly focused on her phone. Wednesday, I heard there's some other woman trying to get between you and Tyler, Morticia said, her voice laced with genuine curiosity but also a hint of concern as she regarded her daughter. Wednesday's gaze darkened as she crossed her arms, a cold edge in her voice. For some reason, they don't seem to want to fire her, even though she can't keep her plant alive. She shot a pointed glare at her cousin Adele, who merely raised an eyebrow, unfazed. You can't fire a teacher just because you killed her plants, Wednesday, Adele said with a mockingly regretful smile. If that were the case, I'd be unemployed by now. Wednesday's expression didn't soften. What will it take then? She asked seriously, leaning forward, her eyes unblinking. Adele shrugged, her smile sharpening just a fraction. She'll definitely be fired if she killed someone, she said, her tone a little too casual. The underlying implication hung in the air between them, and Wednesday, though she understood, chose not to pursue the subject further. The tension in the air shifted, and Morticia, always the master of conversation, gently turned the topic. How has Larissa been treating you, by the way, Adele? Adele gave a little laugh, her fingers tapping rhythmically on her glass. She treats me the same as the other teachers. The big difference? You can't fire me. Gomez leaned in, a mischievous grin forming on his face. Oh, don't underestimate her. Principal Weems has a way of getting what she wants, especially if she uses her shape-shifting abilities. The words seemed to hit Wednesday like a cold gust of wind. She paused, her fork halfway to her mouth, before lowering it and looking up sharply. Principal Weems is a shapeshifter, she asked, her voice laced with disbelief and intrigue. Morticia's eyes glinted with nostalgia, a smile tugging at her lips. Of course, she said, leaning back and staring off into the distance as if remembering. She transformed into Judy Garland to win us that talent show back in the day. Wednesday's brow furrowed as she absorbed this new information, the pieces slowly coming together in her mind. That's disturbing. And a bit too convenient for someone with so much power. She let her gaze shift to Adele, who was studying her phone intently, her face unreadable. Adele gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It's not just power. It's manipulation. Shapeshifters are good at disappearing, blending into whatever form they need to take. Weems has always been good at keeping her real self hidden. Tyler sprawled out on his bed, arms behind his head as he stared up at the ceiling, lost in thought. The clutter around him seemed to reflect the chaos swirling inside his mind. His room was a wreck, much like the mess his life had become. He let out a long breath and closed his eyes, trying to silence the buzz of thoughts crowding his brain. Man, Cockroach and her family are really something else to think about, the Hyde's voice slithered into his head, smooth and amused. They managed to obtain that information without ever stepping foot to steal in the sheriff's department or the mayor's office. Tyler couldn't help but chuckle under his breath. You should have heard the stories in their family gatherings, he muttered aloud, his tone low and dark. What they can get away with. It's crazy. That's why we need to play nice with her and her family, the Hyde continued, a twisted grin in his voice. They might keep us out of jail once this whole thing with Laura blows over. Tyler stiffened, irritation bubbling up inside him. He'd heard it all before, the Hyde schemes, always pushing for more, always thinking he could manipulate his way out of everything. He didn't like it. He didn't like any of it. Wednesday is not your get-out-of-jail-free card, he snapped, the frustration seeping into his voice. The Hyde chuckled darkly, she might as well be, Tyler. Imagine joining a whole family with no repercussions. It'd be heaven compared to this place. Tyler clenched his fists at his sides, his mind racing. The thought of using Wednesday, of her family's power to escape the mess he was in, it felt wrong, but there was a sick part of him that almost found it tempting. Almost. What exactly are you planning to do with her after this is all over? Tyler's voice was sharp, challenging. He was tired of the Hyde's plans. He needed answers. The Hyde responded without hesitation, continue our relationship, of course. His voice was smooth, as if the answer was obvious. Tyler's brow furrowed, his heart skipping a beat. Your relationship? She's my girlfriend, Tyler said firmly, his voice betraying a hint of possessiveness. No, Tyler. She's our girlfriend, the Hyde corrected him, and there was a smugness in his tone that made Tyler's blood run cold. I'm intimate with her too. The words hit Tyler like a slap in the face. His stomach churned with disgust. That's because you're in my body, he growled, his fists tightening until his knuckles turned white. The Hyde chuckled softly, a low, taunting sound. Our body, Tyler, he corrected, a strange possessiveness creeping into his voice. What's mine is yours, and what's yours is mine. Tyler's pulse quickened, the weight of the Hyde's words crashing down on him. What's mine is yours, and what's yours is mine. That phrase, that twisted connection between them, unsettled him more than he could explain. It was as though he wasn't truly in control anymore, like he was sharing his very identity with someone who didn't care about boundaries or consent. He sat up quickly, his head spinning. He could feel the Hyde's presence growing stronger, pushing against the edges of his mind, filling the spaces he thought were his own. No, he thought desperately. No, this isn't happening. Tyler paused, his voice trembling with rage and fear. He didn't know how to finish the sentence, didn't know how to articulate the anger that was boiling inside him. You can't just take everything from me, he whispered, barely able to say the words aloud. The Hyde didn't answer right away. Instead, there was a chilling silence in his mind before the voice finally spoke again, calm and unbothered. We're a team, Tyler, the Hyde said, as if that explained everything. What's mine is yours. And what's yours is mine. Tyler clenched his jaw, fighting the sick feeling rising in his throat. This wasn't right. This wasn't what he wanted. But what choice did he have? He was trapped in this shared existence with the Hyde, always pushed to the edge, always being told that everything he felt, everything he did was theirs to claim. "You can't keep doing this," Tyler whispered to himself, though it felt like the words were meant for the Hyde more than anything. "You're going to break me." The Hyde didn't respond. But Tyler could feel him there, lurking, waiting. And somehow, in the silence that followed, Tyler knew that whatever came next, he would have to fight for control. Because if he didn't, there might not be much of himself left to fight for. Tyler went down to the kitchen to grab a couple snacks, his mind still reeling from the earlier conversation with the Hyde. As he rustled through the cabinet, he heard the front door slam, signaling his father's arrival. Tyler turned around to see Donovan walking into the house, looking visibly pissed off. "Wow, the old man looks pissed," the Hyde commented, amusement creeping inside Tyler's head. Tyler raised an eyebrow and stood up, glancing at his father's tense posture. "Long day, Dad?" "You tell me." "Unless you can't tell." "I've been run over by your girlfriend's cousin," Donovan growled, his voice sharp with frustration. "Yeah, I know. I was there this morning," Tyler said quietly, his gaze dropping to the floor. "That family is a pain in the ass," Donovan complained as he slumped into a chair, rubbing his temples. Tyler couldn't help but point out, "Well, to be fair, Dad, you were about to arrest Wednesday's dad based on a suicide note." Donovan's head snapped up, eyes narrowing. "Whose side are you on?" he barked, his voice rising. Tyler took a step back, defensive but calm. "No one's. I'm just saying you could have investigated farther before wrongly accusing someone. Don't you think it's suspicious how this case just fell into your lap the day Wednesday's parents are visiting for the weekend?" Donovan snorted, dismissing Tyler's concerns. "Yeah, and what's so suspicious about that?" Tyler then defended. Adele suspected foul play. The coroner had nothing to be guilty about involving Garrett Gates' case. Why would he kill himself? The Hyde immediately cut in, his voice tinged with irritation inside Tyler's mind. "Hey, stop it. You're gonna put Laura in a panic." Tyler didn't acknowledge the Hyde's warning but responded with a clipped tone, "She just tried to have Mr. Addams arrested. I'm not willing to let that slide." The Hyde snickered inside his mind, "That old hag is a pain in the ass." Before Tyler could say anything more, Donovan's phone rang, interrupting the tension. He glanced at the screen, sighed heavily, and answered the call, his face hardening with every word spoken on the other end. As the call ended, Donovan hung up with a swift motion, his face pale and filled with urgency. He rushed toward the door, not sparing another word to Tyler. "Dad, what happened?" Tyler asked, his voice laced with concern as he followed him to the door. Donovan barely looked at him as he swung the door open. "The mayor has been run over by a car," he said curtly before slamming the door behind him. Tyler stood frozen for a moment, the weight of his father's words sinking in. "Looks like Laura is getting reckless." The Hyde's voice was calm, almost pleased. Tyler didn't know whether to be more disturbed by the news or the Hyde's reaction. Either way, things were spiraling, and he had no idea how much more he could handle. The mayor's accident wasn't just an isolated event, it was the next move in a dangerous game that Tyler wasn't sure he could control anymore. Like, comment, and subscribe to be notified for updates on this series.